Unbeknownst to the rest of the world, the Caucasus is one of the most ethnically diverse regions on the planet. Throughout history, several empires have set their sights on this strategic location, where it spans over 11,000 kilometers, and where mountains alternate with plateaus. Many came, many conquered, and many lost, but they all have somehow left a legacy behind that is still upheld by the more than 50 different ethnicities in the region. In those secluded areas, the people were able to develop and preserve their own culture, and live mostly undisturbed from the troubles of the rest of the world. Some communities are native to these lands, like the Chechens or Caucasians, while others migrated like the Mountain Jews during the 5th century before Christ, the Kalmyks in the 8th, or Pontic Greeks during the 15th century.
Most of the time they all get along, until they don't, when diversity is suddenly not the strength anymore. But merely a means to divide and conquer. As good as all the tribes in the Caucasus had their fair share of terror and suffering under the most powerful empires on this planet, whether it was the Russians, the Soviets or the Ottomans, just to name a few. Countless conflicts can be traced back to ethnic disputes over territory, religious and political beliefs, but also foreign interference. If they do happen, then in many ways, different realities collide, and one of those was the conflict between the Abkhaz and the Ossetians on one side, and the Georgians on the other.
Abkhazia is a small strip of land on the east of the Black Sea, home to the Abkhaz, a native Caucasian tribe. Initially, Abkhazia and Georgia had good relations. When the Red Army invaded in 1918, both nations joined forces and defeated the invaders. Abkhazia then joined Georgia as an independent state.
In 1921, however, the Abkhaz Bolsheviks staged a peasant and workers' rally, like they always do in their communist playbook. And under this disguise, they invited once again their Soviet brothers for unity and support. In 1921, the Soviet invasion of Georgia ended with a defeat of the defenders and the integration of Georgia, as well as Abkhazia, into the Soviet Republic.
Despite their alliance, the Soviets pursued a policy of Georgianization in Abkhazia and encouraged Georgians as well as Armenians to settle in that area. Evidence indicates that elements of the Communist Party of Georgia pursued a long-term strategy of completely assimilating the Abkhaz to Georgian culture. Strong feelings of ethnic identity and separatism arise among Abkhaz, which would lay the foundation for future conflicts. The Ossetians are an indigenous Eastern Iranian ethnic group who live on both sides of the Greater Caucasus, which is why they are separated in North and South Ossetians. After the abdication of the Tsar in 1917, the Ossetians formed a council to designate the future.
At this point, I bet you can already guess what happened, because just like Abkhazia, this council has been undermined by Ossetian Bolsheviks, who called for the unification of North and South Ossetia and the incorporation into Soviet Russia. Georgia, on the other hand, made it pretty easy for the Ossetians to sympathize with the Bolsheviks, because Ossetian farmers refused to pay overbearing taxes to the Tbilisi government, and so they came to collect it.
The offensive of the Georgians People Guard was initially stopped by the Ossetian peasants, but a renewed assault broke the lines and the Ossetians were forced to flee. The rebellion was put down, but not the spirit. The demand for autonomy was still existent, but countless discussions never went anywhere, and so another uprising went through Ossetia, this time with some Bolshevik support. But Lenin felt that maintaining peace with Georgia was more important.
And so once again the rebellion was crushed, but this time many villages were burned down, large areas were depopulated, 5,000 people perished, and 20,000 Ossetians were forced to seek refuge in Soviet Russia. About 8% of the total Ossetian population has been killed.
When the advancing Red Army came to annex Georgia in 1921, their wish was finally granted, with the establishment of the South Ossetian Autonomous Oblast, which included not only Ossetian and mixed Georgian Ossetian settlements, but also purely Georgian villages, and had Valley as its capital, where the Ossetians were a minority at that time.
As you can imagine, the resentments between the Ossetians, Abkhaz and the Georgian governors never really settled. But for now, everyone had to answer to the Soviets, which is one of the reasons why the conflicts were actually frozen. Until the day the Iron Curtain fell, when it was time for round 2.
When it became foreseeable that the Iron Curtain would fall, nationalistic movements gathered to regain the initiative in the late 80s in all parts of the Soviet Union. An organized Georgian mass protest in 1988 resulted in declaring sovereignty and independence as the Republic of Georgia in 1991. 5 months later, Zviad Gamsakhurdia became the first elected president. Around the same time, Ossetians and the Abkhaz had other plans than to be left alone with their overpowering neighbor. And so they once again declared independence from Georgia, which was obviously nullified by the Tbilisi government. But nevertheless, the minorities began to challenge the Georgian majority in the contested territories.
At this point we have come full circle. We are back at the more or less same situation that we left in 1918. But this time there is also a civil war among the Georgians.
Parts of the National Guard launched a mutiny against Gamsakhurdia, following a dispersion of a large protest. On the 22nd of December 1991, a coup d'etat was attempted, which would later be known as the Tbilisi War. On January the 6th, the mutineers defeated the presidential forces and the military council took over, but brutally suppressed any dissidents and protests. The council believed that the experienced Georgian Soviet diplomat Eduard Shevardnadze was better suited to lead the country during this tumultuous period of uncertainty.
And if this wasn't enough, the Russians flooded the whole country with firearms to each and every paramilitary organization that would destabilize Georgia. The outcome was complete chaos. Militias from all sides raided, looted and burned the opposing territories as they saw fit. Even the so-called Georgian National Guard was not better off. It was just a loose term for a ragtag coalition of private militias that were occasionally trained and equipped by the government. Plans for an all-out conscription never went anywhere, since the post-war economy made it impossible to sustain a decent army, and therefore Georgia mostly relied on private initiatives.
When the violence escalated, the Georgians declared a state of emergency and entered the South Ossetian capital, Tbilisi, with about 3,000 men. But instead of a de-escalation, it was taken as an offense. Barricades were set up and the Georgian troops were ambushed all over the city and the surrounding villages. The conflict spread across the whole area. The atmosphere was so hostile that Georgians had mostly left Ossetian territory and vice versa. Several towns were ethnically cleansed, houses which were occupied by regional minorities were singled out, looted and burned down. During the war, approximately 1,000 people died. It also led to the creation of large numbers of refugees. More than 40,000 ethnic Ossetians were forced to flee from South Ossetia, mainly into North Ossetia. The flow of refugees into North Ossetia aggravated the tense ethnic situation there and played a significant role in the Ossetian-Ingush conflict. But for now, the Ossetians prevailed. With the Georgian independence and the coup in Tbilisi, the matter of South Ossetia was left in the background for the rest of the year. Sporadic fighting occurred, but the war still remains for now. Another attempt was made to capture Tbilisi in May 1992, but not only did the Ossetians remain stubborn, Russia also engaged in the conflict. The chairman of the Russian parliament issued a heavy-handed statement against Georgia, accusing Georgia of genocide and threatening to annex South Ossetia if Georgia did not sign a ceasefire agreement. On the placement of Russian peacekeepers, and the Russians meant business. Troops mobilized near the Georgian-Russian border and Russian helicopters annihilated Georgian tanks. The countries were on the brink of war and the relations had never been so tense.
With its back to the war, the Georgians signed the Dagomi Agreement in June 1992, a ceasefire that left South Ossetia divided into areas controlled by Georgia and areas controlled by the unrecognized government of South Ossetia. Estimates suggest about 1,000 fatalities overall, from about 5,000 combatants on each side.
As the conflict in South Ossetia came to a standstill, the tense situation in Abkhazia escalated not even 3 months later. Armed hostilities led the region into a downward spiral. The Georgian government lost increasing control over the territory and deployed the military not only against Abkhazia, but also against pro-Gamsa forces assembled in Mongolia. The railroad system was almost left completely unprotected, which led to frequent attacks and robberies. According to the Georgian government, these robberies overall caused the damage totaling 9 billion mineti, including to neighboring countries such as Armenia, since Armenia, being a landlocked country, was totally dependent on Georgian ports and railroads. On top of that, Georgian government officials were held captive by the Gamsa rebellion. The National Guard was deployed on the 10th of August 1992 and entered Mongolia 2 days later without a fight. They continued their way into Abkhazia peacefully until they were ambushed by the Abkhaz National Guard near Ochamchira, which was one of many to come. Despite the assaults, they reached their aim, the outskirts of the capital city of Abkhazia, Sukhumi. In another attempt to avoid bloodshed, negotiations were held to free the hostages. But the discussions proved fruitless, and so they entered and quickly defeated the Abkhaz National Guard in just 4 days. On top of that, the Georgians landed in Gagra and cut off supply routes from Russia. The Abkhazians retreated to Gudauta for reorganization, while another part of the rebellion retreated into the inaccessible town of Chvakeli. Within just 3 weeks, the war was almost coming to an end, and if it wasn't for the Russian geographical interest in the region, the Georgians would have won. Thousands of volunteer paramilitaries, mainly Chechens and Cossacks from the Confederation of Mountain People of the Caucasus and the Abkhaz military, equipped with T-72 tanks, BM-21 Grad rocket launchers, Sukhoi Su-25 attack planes and helicopters, launched a major offensive. Georgia accused Russia of supplying this equipment, as it had not previously been used by the Abkhaz.
One of those Chechen volunteers was the infamous Shamil Basayev, who apparently trained under direct command from a Russian military intelligence. In other words, he did the dirty work for Russia until he decided to turn against them during the Chechen Wars.
With that military might, Georgia was losing slowly city after city, but the Georgians remained stubborn. Gagra was lost only after multiple assaults. Ochamchire was recaptured and the surrounding villages of Sukhumi only after 8 months of fighting. As if this wasn't enough, the Gamza forces recaptured Mingralia and cut off supply lines along the coast. The conflict was mediated for now with another Sochi ceasefire agreement on July 27, 1993, which was violated by the Abkhaz to finally capture Sukhumi and declared victory on the 27th of August 1993. Georgia was only able to keep the Kodori Valley and reoccupy Mingralia, where they finally eliminated Gamza and his entourage.
Although the Abkhazians were outnumbered and not united in their goal of independence, their radical minority only succeeded through foreign interference. However, those radicals also are responsible for the vast majority of human rights violations. About 200,000 Georgians were expelled more or less peacefully, and with that they reached their personal goal to become the majority of the country, as the Abkhaz population prior to the war was just made up of 93,300 people, and therefore a significant minority on their home turf.